There is a special kind of silence that exists only in perfect places. It's the silence of a museum after hours, of a freshly fallen snow that has erased all sound, of a heart that has learned to beat without making a disturbance. Arthur lived in that silence. He had spent 47 years building it, pruning his life with the meticulous care of a master gardener tending to a rare and fragile specimen. He had removed the weeds of messy emotion, the dead branches of failed relationships, the unruly vines of unpredictable passion. What remained was beautiful, ordered, sterile, and as he stood in the impeccable garden of his own creation, he realized with a dawning, suffocating horror that he was utterly alone in it. Nothing grew here anymore, and nothing ever would. The very struggle he had eliminated was the only thing that made life worth living. Pacing note: allow 2 to 3 second pauses after disturbance, specimen, and sterile. The light in Arthur's home office was perfect. It was a calibrated, 4,000 Kelvin daylight simulation that eliminated shadows and eye strain, that turned every surface into a specimen under clinical observation. This morning, it felt like an interrogation lamp. He sat before his computer, a monolithic slab of black glass on a reclaimed wood desk so pristine it seemed to reject the very concept of dust. His fingers rested on the keyboard, not typing. The search bar was empty. It was a clean slate, a digital representation of the silence he had cultivated. But the silence was different now. It was no longer peaceful. It was waiting. The memory of the breaking vase replayed in his mind not as an emotional catastrophe, but as a structural failure. He analyzed the fracture patterns, the angle of impact, the material density of the ceramic. He thought he had contained the event by processing it through the lens of physics. He was wrong. The analysis was just a container, and the container was leaking. His thumb tapped the spacebar, waking the screen. The empty search bar stared back. He did not type her name. Not at first. He typed the name of her studio, the one she had talked about starting all those years ago, when such dreams seemed to him like building a house on sand. Clay and fire ceramics. He hit enter. The results loaded. He expected nothing. He expected a defunct website, a forgotten business listing. He found a thriving website, an Instagram feed with tens of thousands of followers, articles in design blogs. The studio was real. She had done it. She had built her house on sand, and it had not only stood, it had become a landmark. He clicked on her portfolio. The screen filled with vessels that were defiantly, joyfully imperfect. Bowls with deliberate thumbprint dimples. Vases that listed to one side as if listening to a secret. Cups with glazes that pooled and fractured like dried riverbeds. Each piece was a rebellion against everything he stood for. Each piece was a masterpiece. His office, once a sanctuary of control, now felt like a cage. The perfectly aligned books on the shelf were not orderly. They were stagnant. The clean lines of the architecture were not peaceful. They were restrictive. The air, filtered and temperature-controlled, was not fresh. It was dead. He leaned closer. In a series titled Kintsugi Studies, he saw broken pieces of pottery mended with seams of gold. The philosophy was stated plainly on the page, not hiding the break, but making it part of the object's history. The break is where the light enters. His chest tightened, a physiological response, a spike in blood pressure, a constriction of the diaphragm. He noted it clinically, stress response to cognitive dissonance. He navigated to her about page. There was her photograph, Clara. 20 years had traced fine lines around her eyes, but they were the lines of smiling. Her hair, once wild and long, was now an elegant silver-streaked bob, but it still looked as if it had just been touched by a breeze. She was looking at the camera, but not posing for it. She was simply there, present, utterly herself. And then he read her artist's statement. "I don't believe in mistakes," it began. "I believe in conversations with the material. Sometimes the clay wants to crack. Sometimes the glaze wants to run. My job isn't to command it, but to listen, to collaborate with the chaos. The most beautiful things I've ever made emerged from what I initially perceived as failure. The crack isn't the end of the piece. It's the beginning of its true story." Arthur pushed back from the desk. The wheels of his chair rolled soundlessly on the wool rug. He stood up and walked to the window. His view was of other modern buildings, geometric shapes of glass and steel against a pale sky, a cityscape of perfect angles, a world of controlled outcomes. He thought of his own work, the architectural designs that won awards for their efficiency, their sleekness, their flawless execution, buildings that were solved equations. He thought of the client he had just appeased, steering them away from a risky design element in favor of something safer, more predictable, more sterile. He had built a career on eliminating the crack. He had built a life on preventing the break. And now, looking at Clara's vibrant, messy, glorious work, he understood with a chilling clarity. She had a body of work. He had a portfolio of solutions. She had created a world. He had managed risk. The thought was a hairline fracture in his own foundation. Small, barely visible, but he felt it spread through him, a fine, sharp web of understanding. He had been so afraid of the broken vase that he had never considered the golden seam that could make it whole again. He had been so terrified of failure that he had never learned the art of repair. He returned to his desk. The clinical light felt harsh now, exposing not clarity, but emptiness. He looked at Clara's picture one more time, at the easy confidence in her eyes, at the life that radiated from her. He had left her because her world was too unpredictable. He had chosen the safety of silence. Now the silence was deafening. The conference room was a glass box suspended above the city, a terrarium of ambition and anxiety. Arthur took his seat at the polished table, the cold leather of the chair a familiar shock against his back. Sunlight, sharp and merciless, ricocheted off the steel and glass of neighboring towers, filling the room with a blinding, sterile energy. It was the kind of light that exposed every flaw, every smudge, every uncertain thought. He felt raw. Clara's words, "The crack isn't the end of the piece. It's the beginning of its true story," had echoed in the silence of his morning, a haunting melodic counterpoint to the rigid rhythm of his routine. He had tried to shave with his usual precision, but his hand had jerked at the memory, nicking his jaw. A single bead of blood, a tiny, perfect red sphere on white porcelain, an imperfection. He had stared at it, transfixed, until the water washed it away. Now, in this temple of control, he felt the nick stinging beneath his starched collar. A persistent, tiny pain. The junior designers filed in. Among them was Leo, 24 years old, his energy a barely contained electrical storm. He clutched a tablet to his chest like a shield, his eyes alight with the terrifying, beautiful conviction of the young. Arthur watched him. Leo's hair was slightly too long. His tie was a splash of unapproved color. He was a walking risk assessment. The Henderson Project, the senior partner began, his voice a smooth, featureless plane. Preliminary concepts. Leo, you had some unconventional thoughts. Let's see them. Leo stood, his movements a little too quick, a little too eager. He synced his tablet to the large screen. The image that bloomed across the wall was not a building. It was a forest, a structure of swirling, organic forms, with terraces that cascaded like waterfalls and facades that mimicked the irregular bark of trees. Light wells were designed to cast dappled, shifting patterns throughout the day. It was messy. It was alive. It was breathtaking. "I'm calling it symbiosis," Leo said, his voice trembling with the effort to sound professional. The core idea is that the building shouldn't dominate the landscape. It should converse with it. It's about embracing natural asymmetry, about allowing for a kind of beautiful chaos. Beautiful chaos. The words hung in the air, a direct challenge to every principle in the room. Arthur felt his stomach clench. He saw Clara's face in the organic curves of the design. He heard her laugh in the audacity of it. This was her philosophy, rendered in architectural form. It was a ghost manifesting in his boardroom. The senior partners were silent, their faces unreadable tablets of judgment. Then all eyes turned to Arthur, the lead designer, the voice of reason, the man who ensured nothing was ever too much. Arthur stood. He walked to the screen. The room was so quiet he could hear the hum of the projector, the faint whistle of air through the vents. He could feel Leo's hope radiating toward him, a physical heat. He pointed a laser pointer at the central atrium. The red dot was a pinprick of blood on the digital rendering. Structurally, this curvature presents a significant and, I would argue, unnecessary load-bearing challenge. He began, his voice flat, devoid of inflection. It was the voice of a machine analyzing faulty code. The deviation from standard rectilinear forms increases material costs by an estimated 34%. He moved the dot. These light wells, unpredictable, inefficient, they create hotspots and dead zones. A standardized window grid would provide uniform, controllable illumination. He moved the dot again. And this organic facade, maintenance nightmare, how do you clean it? How do you repair it? There are no repeatable components. Every piece would be a custom fabrication. It's not a design. It's a collection of problems waiting to happen. With every sentence, he was not criticizing the design. He was dissecting the philosophy behind it. He was methodically pruning the wild, beautiful vine of Leo's idea, cutting it back to the sterile root. He was building a perfect, empty garden. And he was doing it with surgical precision. He saw Leo's posture change. The shoulders, once squared with excitement, began to slump. The light in his eyes didn't just dim. It guttered out, like a candle submerged in water. Arthur watched it happen. He noted the physiological responses, the dropped gaze, the shallow breath, the slight tremor in the hands. Data points. But then he saw something else. Something that was not a data point. It was a reflection. In Leo's defeated posture, he saw the ghost of the young man he himself had once been, the one who had dared to dream before he learned to fear. In the extinguishing of that creative light, he saw himself, 20 years ago, carefully packing away his own messy, ambitious heart in a box labeled impractical. He was not just killing a project. He was performing an exorcism on his own past. He finished. The concept is creatively ambitious, but fundamentally unsound. We proceed with the standardized high-efficiency model. The meeting adjourned. The partners filed out, murmuring approvals of Arthur's sound judgment. Leo stood alone by the screen, staring at his defeated forest, his tablet dark at his side. Arthur gathered his notes. He needed to leave. He needed air that wasn't recycled through 100 filters. As he passed Leo, the young man didn't look up. He just whispered, so softly Arthur almost didn't hear it. I just thought, it could be something beautiful. The words were not an accusation. They were a eulogy. And in that moment, Arthur Lemay, the architect of perfect silence, understood the true cost of his philosophy. He had not maintained order. He had committed a murder. The body was on the floor, and the spirit was broken. And the killer was standing in a glass room, holding a perfectly organized set of notes, feeling more monstrous than he had ever thought possible. The park was not on Arthur's route home. It was in the opposite direction, a deliberate detour from his life's carefully mapped coordinates. He walked without purpose, his polished leather shoes scuffing against gravel paths for the first time. Each scuff felt like a small rebellion. This wasn't the manicured civic garden near his office, all regimented flower beds and warning signs. This was a forgotten corner of the city, a place where nature had negotiated a messy truce with urban planning. Weeds pushed through cracked pavement. Dandelions stood defiant in patches of struggling grass. The air smelled different here. Damp earth, decomposing leaves, and something else, something alive. He found a bench weathered to a soft, silver gray, its wood grain telling a story of decades of rain and sun. He sat, his body folding into the posture of defeat. The image of Leo's extinguished passion played behind his eyes on a relentless loop. I just thought it could be something beautiful. From his bench, Arthur watched an old man working in a neglected flower bed near a stand of wild, untamed birch trees. The man moved with a slow, deliberate economy that was the opposite of frailty. He wasn't gardening so much as conversing with the earth. Arthur watched, his analytical mind initially trying to categorize the activity. The man would kneel, run his fingers through the soil, sometimes pulling a weed, sometimes letting it be. He'd trim a branch here, but leave another that looked even more unruly. There was no visible pattern, no design principle Arthur could discern. It was chaos. After 20 minutes of this silent observation, Arthur's professional compulsion overrode his despair. He stood and approached. The old man, David, though Arthur didn't know his name yet, didn't look up. He was examining a thick, woody vine with clusters of small, hard green berries that had choked a struggling hydrangea bush. "That's invasive," Arthur stated, his voice cutting through the gentle rustle of leaves. He pointed at the vine. "Ampelopsis brevipedunculata, porcelain berry. It will strangle everything else. You should remove it." David's hands, caked with dark soil, paused their work. He looked up, and his eyes were the color of the sky just before rain, clear and knowing. He didn't seem surprised by Arthur's presence or his unsolicited advice. "Should I?" David asked, his voice a low rumble, like stones shifting in a riverbed. He plucked one of the green berries and rolled it between his thumb and forefinger. "It's aggressive, sure, but the birds like the berries in the fall, and it provides cover for the rabbits." He looked from the berry to Arthur. "You sound like you know your plants." "I know systems," Arthur corrected, the words coming out sharper than he intended. "I know efficiency. That vine is an inefficiency. It's a flaw in the design." David gave a soft, breathy sound that wasn't quite a laugh. He looked around at the wild patch of earth. "Design? You think this has a design?" He gestured to the tangle of native and invasive species, the struggling and the thriving, all existing in a complex, messy web. "This isn't a design. It's a conversation. I'm just one of the voices in it." Arthur stared, baffled. A conversation? With weeds? It was the most illogical, sentimental thing he had ever heard. It was exactly the kind of thinking that led to failed projects and broken vases and beautiful, impossible buildings that would never be built. David seemed to read the skepticism on his face. He pushed himself up with a soft grunt, brushing the dirt from his knees. He pointed to a nearby oak tree, its bark thick and gnarled. "See that scar? Lightning strike 10 years back. I could have cut the branch. Most would have, but I left it. The tree sealed it over itself, made that beautiful twisted pattern you see. It's stronger there now than it was before." His eyes returned to Arthur, holding his gaze. The wound became part of its strength, its story. Arthur felt the words land not in his mind, but in his gut. The wound became part of its strength. He thought of the crack in the vase. He thought of the flaw in his own perfect life, the one he was now sitting in the middle of. "A gardener doesn't control the plant," David continued, turning back to his work, his voice conversational, as if stating a simple, obvious fact. "He controls the conditions, the soil, the water, the light, so the plant can control its own growth. You're trying to sculpt a tree into a chair. You'll end up with neither." He said it so plainly, so effortlessly, as if dismantling the entire foundation of Arthur's existence was as simple as pulling a weed. Arthur stood there, silent. The wind moved through the birch trees, a sound like 1,000 soft whispers. He had no rebuttal, no data to counter the old man's logic. The philosophy of total control, which had been the bedrock of his life, suddenly felt like a child's simplistic drawing next to a masterpiece. He wasn't looking at a failed garden. He was looking at a living, breathing system, complex and resilient in its messiness. It was not perfect, but it was alive in a way his apartment, his office, his entire life was not. He turned without another word and walked back to his bench. He didn't look at the city skyline. He looked at the wild earth, at the old man who spoke to weeds, at the lightning-scarred oak. The sterile silence in his head was finally, blessedly, being filled with the sound of the wind and the distant, unsettling echo of a new and terrifying question. What if he had been tending the wrong garden all along? The click of the apartment door locking behind him was the loudest sound Arthur had ever heard. It was the sound of a vault ceiling. The air inside was still and processed, exactly 21 degrees Celsius, exactly 45% humidity. It was air that had given up on being weather. He stood in the entryway, his keys held tightly in his hand. The silence was different tonight. It wasn't empty. It was watchful. The clean lines of the hallway seemed to press in on him, the white walls feeling less like a choice in minimalism and more like the padded walls of an asylum. His own asylum. His eyes scanned the room, seeking comfort in the familiar order. But his perception had been fractured. David's words had rewired his vision. The perfectly aligned books on the floating shelf were not orderly. They were prisoners on death row. The single abstract painting, centered with laser precision, was not a focal point. It was a single, desperate idea in a sea of nothing. The stainless steel kitchen appliances were not sleek. They were cold, surgical tools for the maintenance of a corpse. His gaze fell upon the bonsai. It sat on a dedicated stand by the window, a Japanese white pine. He had owned it for 15 years. It was the ultimate expression of his philosophy. Every needle was in its place. Every twist of its miniature trunk was the result of years of patient, ruthless wiring. It was a tree that had been conquered. A wild thing made perfectly, permanently docile. He had been proud of it. Now he saw it for what it was, a beautifully crafted monument to control. A living thing that had been stopped from living. He walked toward it, his footsteps muffled by the thick wool rug. He reached out a hand, his fingers hovering just above the perfectly shaped canopy. He could feel the faint, trapped energy of it like a vibration. This tree had not grown in years. It had only been maintained. A memory surfaced, sharp and unbidden. Leo's face in the boardroom, the light dying in his eyes. The same light he had seen in Clara's eyes 20 years ago, when he told her their relationship was too unpredictable. The same light he had methodically extinguished in himself. He had not been building a life. He had been wiring a bonsai, and he was the tree. The realization hit him not as a thought, but as a physical blow. A wave of nausea rolled through him, so violent he had to grip the bonsai's stand to steady himself. His knuckles turned white. The room began to tilt. You're trying to sculpt a tree into a chair. He was a chair. A beautiful, useless, empty chair in a silent, perfect room. His breathing came in short, ragged gasps. The calibrated air felt thin, insufficient. He was suffocating on his own perfection. He stumbled back from the bonsai, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird beating against a glass pane. This was not stress. This was disintegration. He looked around his apartment, and for the first time he saw the truth. This was not a home. It was a museum dedicated to the life he had failed to live. Every clean surface was a tombstone for a messy, beautiful possibility he had killed. The silence was the cumulative silence of 1,000 conversations never had, 1,000 laughs never laughed, 1,000 risks never taken. He had pruned away everything that mattered. A sound escaped him, a choked, guttural noise that was part sob, part roar. It was a sound that had no place here, in this temple of quiet. It was the sound of the tree remembering it was a tree. He clutched at his chest, sure he was having a heart attack. But it wasn't his heart that was breaking. It was the elaborate, crystalline structure of his identity, shattering from the inside out. The flaw he had spent a lifetime trying to eliminate wasn't a minor crack. It was a fundamental fault line, and it was splitting him open. He collapsed into his designer armchair, but he couldn't sit still. His skin was crawling with the horror of self-recognition. He was the invasive vine, strangling his own spirit. He was the gardener, pruning his own soul to death. He was the bonsai, stunted and trapped. He was a system in catastrophic failure. He sat there for an hour, or maybe 3, paralyzed by the wreckage of his own understanding. The panic slowly receded, leaving behind a vast, desolate calm, the emotional equivalent of scorched earth. His eyes, raw and dry, returned to the bonsai. It sat in its ceramic pot, a perfect, tiny prisoner. And in that moment, he knew with a certainty that bypassed all logic and planning, that he could not share this prison with it for one more night. He had to let it go, even if it died, especially if it died, because its death in the wild would be a more honest life than its continued existence in this beautiful, empty cage. The night air was a shock to his system. It was alive with sounds his apartment had filtered out, the distant hum of a city that never quite slept, the rustle of leaves dancing in a breeze he couldn't control, the faint scent of rain on pavement. He carried the canvas bag carefully, the weight of the small tree feeling immense, like he was carrying his own heart in his hands. He drove through streets glistening with recent rain, the stoplights painting the wet asphalt in streaks of red and green. He didn't think about destination. His car seemed to know the way, turning toward the park with an instinct that bypassed his navigating mind. The bonsai sat upright in the passenger seat, a silent companion on this midnight pilgrimage. When he reached the park, it was swallowed by a deep, velvety darkness, broken only by the occasional amber glow of a distant street lamp. The gates were closed. He parked nearby and climbed over the low stone wall, his dress shoes slipping on the damp moss. The act felt criminal and holy all at once. He walked into the heart of the wild garden, the place where he had met David. The world was reduced to sound and texture. Wet grass soaked through his trousers. Twigs snapped under his feet like tiny bones. Somewhere, an owl called out, a question mark in the dark. He knelt. The earth was soft and yielding beneath his knees. He set the bag down and gently lifted the bonsai out. In the faint light, its perfectly shaped silhouette looked absurdly delicate against the sprawling, untamed backdrop of the real world. A porcelain doll in a wrestling ring. He didn't have a trowel. He used his hands. The feeling of cold, wet soil pushing up under his fingernails was a primal shock. He dug, his city-soft hands scraping against stones and roots, the dirt packing into the lines of his palms. He was breaking rules. He was making a mess. And with every handful of earth he displaced, he felt a corresponding weight lift from his chest. The hole was rough, uneven, nothing like the precise, measured container the tree had known. It was a wild, gaping mouth. He hesitated for a moment, looking at the tree's root ball, a tight, tangled knot that had been constrained for 15 years. He was about to expose it to everything he had spent his life protecting it from. Unpredictable weather, competing roots, insects, decay. He thought of David's words. A gardener doesn't control the plant. He controls the conditions. This was the opposite of control. This was surrender. This was faith. He placed the bonsai in the ground. The act was clumsy. The tree listed slightly to the left. A professional gardener would have winced. Arthur just watched, his breath held. He pushed the soil back around the roots, patting it down with his stained, dirty hands. He did not try to straighten the tree. He let it lean. When he was finished, he sat back on his heels. There it was, his masterpiece of control, planted in the heart of chaos. It looked small. It looked vulnerable. It looked terrified. It looked real. A light rain began to fall, a soft pattering on the leaves above him. He didn't seek shelter. He remained kneeling, watching the water bead on the bonsai's needles, washing the city dust from them. He was soaked, his expensive clothes ruined, his hands caked with mud. He had never felt cleaner. He had not fixed anything. He had not solved a problem. He had not ensured a successful outcome. In fact, he had probably just condemned the tree to a slow death. But for the first time in decades, he had participated in a process where the outcome wasn't guaranteed. He had collaborated with the unknown. This wasn't a solution. It was a question. And for now, that was enough. The bonsai was no longer a symbol of his control. It was a prayer, a question mark planted in the dark earth. A first, trembling seed of hope. He didn't know if it would live, but he knew with a certainty that settled deep in his bones that whatever happened to it now would be true. Its story was no longer his to write. It had been returned to the author of all wild and growing things. He stood up, his body stiff and cold, but his spirit strangely, quietly alert. He left the bonsai there in the rain and the dark. He left his perfect, stunted self beside it, buried in the rich, black soil. He walked back to his car, a muddy, dripping mess, feeling more like a man than he had in 20 years. The empty bonsai stand stared back at him from the window. It was a clean, square patch of sunlight on the floor, a negative space that held more meaning than the object it once supported. Arthur stood before it, still in his damp, mud-caked trousers. The physical evidence of his midnight rebellion felt like armor. He had showered, watching the dark soil swirl down the drain, but the memory of the earth under his nails remained. The feeling was a ghost in his hands. He made coffee but didn't measure the grounds. The resulting brew was bitter and strong. He drank it anyway. His laptop sat open on the kitchen counter, a black portal to a world of measured interactions and professional polish. He opened a new email. The cursor blinked in the to field, a tiny, relentless metronome. He typed her address from memory, Clara@clayandfire.com. He was surprised the muscle memory was still there, buried under 2 decades of deliberate forgetting. The subject line remained blank. His fingers hovered over the keys. A dozen openings drafted themselves in his mind, each more polished and defensive than the last. Clara, I trust this email finds you well. I've been reflecting recently on our past association. No, that was the voice of the man who had just broken Leo's spirit. Clara, you'll never believe what I did last night. No, that demanded a familiarity he had forfeited. He deleted everything. The blank white screen was a field of fresh snow, and he was afraid to take the first step, to mar the perfection with his clumsy, uncertain footprints. He thought of the bonsai sitting crooked in the wild earth. He had not waited for the perfect conditions. He had not researched the optimal soil composition. He had simply dug a hole and placed his faith in the process. He took a breath that felt like his first in years, and let his fingers fall to the keys. He wrote without thinking, without editing, the words flowing directly from the raw, exposed nerve endings of his new self. Clara, the vase broke. The simplicity of the statement shocked him. It was just a fact, an event. There was no blame, no justification, no context. It was the truest thing he had ever written to her. He continued, the words coming faster now. I think I needed it to. I've spent 20 years building a life where nothing breaks, where nothing is even allowed to crack. I thought I was building something strong. I was wrong. I was building something dead. I saw your work online. It's beautiful. It's so alive it hurts to look at. You were right. About everything. I was an idiot. A terrified, controlling idiot. I am sorry. For everything. Arthur. He read it over. It was a mess. It was emotionally chaotic. It was grammatically suspect. It was full of raw, unprocessed feeling. It was, he realized, the most honest piece of communication he had ever composed. His thumb, the one that had found the hairline crack in the vase, hovered over the trackpad. The send button glowed, a tiny green siren call. Every fiber of his old being screamed at him to delete it, to craft something more measured, to protect himself. He saw the empty stand again, the negative space, the potential. He thought of Leo's face. I just thought it could be something beautiful. He clicked send. The whoosh sound of the email leaving his outbox was a tiny, seismic event in the silent room. It was done. There was no undo, no recall. The message was now in the universe, a digital seed cast into the wild, unpredictable soil of Clara's life. He felt violently ill. His heart hammered. He had just exposed his soft, undefended underbelly to someone he had hurt deeply. He had no control over her reaction. She might delete it. She might reply with anger. She might forward it to friends as a joke. She might simply ignore it. He had no control. And for the first time, that felt less like a catastrophe and more like a form of liberation. He didn't close the laptop. He didn't pace. He simply stood there, feeling the terrifying, exhilarating vulnerability of having been honest. He had not offered an explanation. He had offered an apology. He had not tried to rebuild a bridge. He had simply acknowledged the river that flowed between them. The empty bonsai stand no longer looked like a void. It looked like a promise, a space where something new and real might one day choose to grow. He had planted one seed in the wild earth and another in the digital ether. He had no guarantee either would take root, but he had planted them, and that, for now, was the entire victory. The office air still hummed with the same recycled silence, but Arthur heard it differently now. It was no longer the sound of efficiency, but the sound of held breath. He walked to his glass-walled office, acutely aware of the young man standing at the coffee machine, Leo, staring into his mug as if reading tea leaves of his own failed ambition. Arthur's usual routine would have been to close his door, to create a barrier between himself and the messy human uncertainty outside. Today he left it open. The act felt like rolling a stone away from a tomb. He sat at his desk and looked at the schematic on his screen, the standardized high-efficiency model for the Henderson project. It was flawless. It was soulless. It was a eulogy for Leo's forest. His fingers, which usually danced across the keyboard with decisive certainty, felt heavy and clumsy. He opened a new file. He didn't know what he was going to do, only what he could no longer do. He stood and walked to his doorway. "Leo?" he said, his voice sounding unfamiliar to his own ears, softer, without its usual edge of impatience. "Could you come in for a moment?" Leo's head snapped up, his body tensing like a deer catching a predator's scent. He set his mug down too hard, the sound a sharp punctuation mark in the quiet office. He walked toward Arthur's office as if approaching a gallows. "Close the door, please," Arthur said. Leo's shoulders slumped almost imperceptibly. Here it was, the final dressing down, the post-mortem on his career. Arthur gestured to the chair opposite his desk. "Sit." Leo sat, his back rigid, his eyes fixed on a point somewhere over Arthur's shoulder. Arthur didn't sit behind his desk, the traditional position of the judge. He pulled a chair around and sat facing Leo. The physical shift was small, but in the language of the office it was revolutionary. "Your concept for the Henderson project," Arthur began. He saw Leo flinch, bracing for the blow. "The symbiosis design. I understand it was impractical," Leo said quickly, the words rehearsed. "I let the creative impulse override the practical constraints. It won't happen again." Arthur was silent for a moment, letting the young man's defensive words hang in the air between them. He heard the ghost of his own voice in them, the need to preempt criticism by admitting failure first. "I didn't ask you in here to criticize it," Arthur said, his voice low. "I asked you in here because I was wrong." Leo's eyes, wide and disbelieving, finally met his. "I was the one who was impractical," Arthur continued, the admission feeling like pulling a thorn from his own flesh. "I was so focused on preventing failure that I couldn't see the value in the attempt. I pruned your idea before it had a chance to bear fruit." He turned his monitor so Leo could see the blank file. "I don't want to go back to my safe, sterile design. And I don't want you to simply recreate your original concept. I want us to try something else." Leo stared, utterly disarmed. "What?" "I want you to teach me how to listen to the material," Arthur said, the words feeling both absurd and profoundly right. "Your concept was about conversation. So let's have one. Not you defending, not me attacking. Conversation. About how we can bring the soul of symbiosis into a structure that can actually stand. Show me where the light wants to enter." For a long moment, Leo just looked at him, searching his face for the trap, the sarcasm, the hidden agenda. Finding none, the change in him was physical. The defensive hunch of his shoulders relaxed. The guarded light in his eyes kindled into a genuine, cautious spark. "The central atrium," Leo began, his voice tentative at first, then gaining strength. "The curvature doesn't have to be a liability. If we use a geodesic approach for that section, we can maintain the organic form while distributing the load." Arthur listened. He didn't interrupt. He didn't immediately calculate the cost. He watched the young man come alive, his hands sketching shapes in the air, his words tumbling out in an excited, unpolished rush. It was messy. It was inefficient. It was one of the most beautiful things Arthur had witnessed in years. He was not sculpting a tree into a chair. He was providing the trellis for a vine to find its own sun. He had not fixed anything. He had simply stopped breaking it. And in that cessation, something began, tentatively, to grow. The reply from Clara did not come that day, or the next. The silence from her end of the universe was absolute. The old Arthur would have analyzed this silence, dissected its meaning, drafted follow-up emails in his mind, each one more desperate and less authentic than the last. The new Arthur simply let the silence be. He worked with Leo on their hybrid design, a strange and beautiful creature that bore the DNA of both their minds. It was evolving in ways neither could have predicted. Some days it felt brilliant. Other days it felt like a disaster in the making. Arthur was learning to be comfortable with both sensations. On the third day of waiting, clouds the color of bruised velvet gathered over the city. By afternoon, the rain began. Not a violent storm, but a steady, patient downpour that washed the dust from the streets and the certainty from his mind. He left the office without an umbrella. The park was transformed. The rain tapped a million tiny drums on every leaf, every blade of grass, every patch of bare earth. The air smelled of wet stone and revelation. He walked to the wild garden, his shoes sinking into the softening ground, his suit jacket growing heavy with moisture. He went to check on the bonsai. He half expected to find it dead, uprooted by the wind, drowned by the rain, a symbol of his foolish sentimentality. Instead, he found it changed. It was still leaning at its same slight angle, but the rain had washed its needles to a vibrant, defiant green. It looked less like a captive and more like a settler. It was struggling, yes, but it was struggling toward the light, in real soil under a real sky. The struggle had meaning. He didn't try to straighten it. He didn't clear away the competing weeds. He simply stood as the rain soaked through his hair, plastered his shirt to his skin, traced cold paths down his face. He thought of Clara, somewhere in the city, living her life. He had no control over whether she read his email or what she felt when she did. He had no control over whether she would ever reply. The outcome was hers to determine. His part was complete. He had planted the seed. The weather would do what it would. He thought of Leo's design moving through the corporate approval process. He had no control over whether the clients would accept their messy, beautiful hybrid. He had done his best to nurture it. Now it had to survive on its own merits. He thought of the bonsai, its roots slowly, tentatively, exploring the wild earth. He had no control over whether it would live or die. He could only hope it was strong enough to face the seasons. He had spent a lifetime building a fortress against the storm. Now he stood in the rain, unprotected, and discovered the storm itself was cleansing. The things he couldn't control weren't threats, they were just weather. And he was just a man getting wet. A profound quiet settled over him, a silence different from any he had known. It wasn't the silence of absence, but the silence of presence. The silence of things simply being what they were. The rain falling, the tree growing, the heart beating. He was not happy. Happiness was too simple a word for this complex, bittersweet peace. He was reconciled. Reconciled to the mess, to the uncertainty, to the beautiful, terrifying fact that he was not the architect of the universe, but merely a guest in it. He looked at his hands, pale and wrinkled from the rain. They were not the hands of a master gardener who could command growth. They were the hands of a man who could sometimes, if he was lucky, create the conditions for something to grow on its own terms. The rain began to lighten. A patch of silver light appeared between the clouds. He turned and walked away from the bonsai, leaving it to its fate. He walked through the glistening park, his waterlogged shoes making soft, squelching sounds. He did not feel like a man who had lost control. He felt like a man who had finally come home to the only world that had ever existed, the imperfect, unpredictable, breathtakingly beautiful real one. 6 months later, Arthur stood in his apartment, but it was no longer his apartment. It had become his home. The change was subtle, visible only to someone who knew the archaeology of its previous perfection. The bonsai stand by the window now held the succulent Leo had given him. It had grown lopsided, reaching stubbornly toward the light in a way that would have once driven Arthur to rotate it daily. Now he admired its determination. On the bookshelf, between the perfectly aligned volumes, sat the broken pieces of Clara's vase, carefully arranged in a shadow box. Not as a memorial to what was broken, but as a celebration of what had been beautiful. A golden seam of epoxy held the largest pieces together, his own clumsy, heartfelt attempt at kintsugi. He was waiting for guests. Leo was coming along with his partner, and David, the gardener. The table was set, but not with the surgical precision of before. The plates were slightly off-center. The napkins were folded with a comfortable carelessness. A bottle of wine stood open, breathing. When the doorbell rang, the sound didn't startle him. It felt like part of the music of the evening. Leo arrived first, his hand clasped in that of a smiling man named Ben. They brought with them a gust of laughter and the scent of cool autumn air. Then came David, his hands still bearing the faint, ground-in stain of earth, carrying a small pot of rosemary. "For remembrance," he'd said with a wink, pressing it into Arthur's hands. The apartment filled with voices, with the clink of glasses, with the easy chaos of conversation. Arthur moved through it not as a conductor demanding perfect harmony, but as a gardener enjoying the wild orchestra of life. Later, as twilight settled and the city lights began to glitter like scattered seeds, they sat around the table. The talk turned to the Henderson Project. Their hybrid design, dubbed the Symbiosis after all, had been approved. Not in its original wild form, and not in Arthur's sterile alternative, but as something entirely new that carried the soul of both. "It wouldn't have happened without you," Leo said, looking at Arthur. "You saw the value in the mess." Arthur shook his head, a genuine smile touching his eyes for what felt like the 100th time that evening. "No," he said softly. "I finally stopped seeing the mess as a problem to be solved. I started seeing it as a conversation to be had." David nodded slowly, his wise eyes crinkling at the corners. "That's the whole of it," he rumbled. "That's the entire secret." After they left, Arthur stood at his window looking down at the park below. He could just make out the silhouette of his bonsai, now blanketed in twilight. It had survived. It hadn't thrived in the explosive way of fairy tales, but it had put out new, tender growth in the spring. It was stronger for its struggles. It was more interesting for its scars. He thought of Clara. She had never replied to his email, and somehow that felt exactly right. The apology had not been for her response, but for his own freedom. The act of sending it had been the point. The seed had been planted, and in the planting he had been transformed. His home was quiet again, but the silence was different. It was a fertile silence, rich with the echoes of laughter and the promise of future conversations. It was the silence of soil after planting, holding within it countless possibilities. He was no longer the gardener of perfect things. He was the tender of a different garden altogether, a garden of second chances, of collaborative ideas, of mended cracks and lopsided succulents. A garden where things were allowed to grow in their own time, in their own way. He had spent decades pruning his life of every flaw and failure. He had stood in that beautiful, empty garden and understood its terrible secret. Nothing grew there. Now his garden was imperfect. It was messy. It was alive. And for the first time in his life, Arthur Lemay was truly, completely at home.